There is a particular kind of silence that belongs only to markets before dawn. It is not the silence of emptiness. It is the silence of things waiting to become themselves again. The yam pyramids crouching under their tarpaulins. The tomatoes in their flat wooden trays, still cool from the night. The iron poles of the stalls holding up the sky while the sellers are still at home tying their wrappers, warming their mouths with water, preparing their faces for the day. It is a silence that knows it will soon be broken, and so it holds itself gently, the way you hold something you love before you let it go. It was into this silence that Chisholm arrived each morning before the other market women, before even the first cockerel had made up its mind about the hour. She was 14 years old and small for her age, with her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness, and she carried a plastic bucket on her head the way she had carried everything since she was old enough to carry anything, with the effortless straight-backed ease that some bodies learn so young they never have to think about it again. She came to set up her mother's stockfish stall. Her mother's knees had begun to argue with the morning cold, and so the arrangement had become that Chisholm arrived first and laid everything out, and her mother appeared an hour later with tea in a flask and apologies she never quite finished saying. It was Chisholm who first noticed, every single morning, that something was different about the space under Mama Adaeze's stall. If this story is already warming your heart, please hit the like button and subscribe to Village Heart. And drop a comment below telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love knowing our little village reaches so far. The stall itself was nothing grand. 4 poles of cracked iron, a sheet of faded blue tarpaulin above, and a low wooden table in front where Adaeze spread whatever small things she had managed to gather that week. Some mornings it was groundnuts in little knotted plastic bags. Other mornings, garden eggs from behind her house, or bitter leaf tied in bundles, or small bottles of palm oil that she had pressed herself on a machine she rented from a woman 3 compounds away. Whatever she could find. Whatever would sell for a little something. She had been in Emeka market for 23 years, first with her husband Ezekiel beside her, then alone. But it was not the stall that Chisholm looked at each morning. It was the space beneath it. Beneath Mama Adaeze's stall, on a piece of flattened cardboard that had once been a carton for tinned tomatoes, lay a woman sleeping. She slept on her side with her knees drawn up and her hands tucked beneath her cheek, and she slept with the deep, surrendered stillness of a body that has stopped fighting the hard ground and made its peace with it. A length of old Ankara cloth was pulled up over her shoulders and the top of her head, printed in faded orange and brown, the pattern of it worn thin in the places where it folded most. Her feet were bare and brown and cracked at the heel, and they poked out from beneath the cloth at an angle that looked uncomfortable, though she did not stir. This was Mama Adaeze, and this was where she slept now. Chisholm always paused at this point in her morning walk through the market. She paused and looked, not with pity, not with the sideways look some of the older women gave, the look that is trying to say something without having to say it. She looked with the simple attention of a young person who has not yet learned to pretend she has not seen something. Then she set down her bucket, opened it quietly so as not to wake her, and took out the small covered bowl she brought every morning from her mother's kitchen. She placed it beside Adaeze's feet where she would see it when she woke. A ball of eba or a piece of yam or whatever had been left from the night before. On good days, a piece of smoked fish wrapped in foil. Then she straightened up and went to set up her mother's stockfish. She never mentioned the bowl when Adaeze woke. Neither did Adaeze. That was the agreement, though it had never been spoken aloud. To understand how a woman like Adaeze came to sleep under her own market stall, you would need to go back far enough to the beginning. Not to her birth, though that was where her story began the way all stories do, in the wordless dark before we have names. You would need to go back to the year she married Ezekiel Okafor of Emeka, a quiet and decent man who smelled of wood shavings because he made furniture in a small workshop behind his father's compound. Ezekiel had strong hands and a slow smile and a habit of tilting his head slightly to the left when he was thinking, and he thought about things carefully before he spoke, which was a quality that Adaeze's mother had called uncommon in a man and therefore worth more than land. They built their life together on a piece of ground that Ezekiel's father left him. Not large, not grand, just enough. A house of 3 rooms with a zinc roof that sang in the rain. A garden in the back where Adaeze grew pepper and uziza and the bitter leaf that she bundled and sold in the market. 3 mango trees that dropped their fruit every June in such quantities that the whole compound smelled of sweetness for weeks. and the children from neighboring houses came to gather the fallen ones and had to be shooed away with a gentleness that made the shoeing useless. It was the life of people who did not have much but managed what they had with care, and managed it well enough that they were comfortable, and comfortable enough that they could sometimes help others who were not. Their son Emeka was born in the 3rd year of their marriage. He came into the world in the middle of the rainy season, on a night when the lightning was so frequent that the room was lit almost steadily, and the midwife said that this was a sign, though she did not say of what. He was a quiet baby who grew into a thoughtful boy who grew into a young man who asked questions about everything and could not be satisfied with the answer that things had always been done a certain way. He took after Ezekiel in the tilt of his head and the slowness of his smile, and after Adaeze in his eyes, which were her eyes exactly, dark and wide and direct in a way that people sometimes found uncomfortable because they could not look at those eyes and tell themselves small lies. Emeka was 19 when his father died. Ezekiel did not die of anything dramatic. He died of the accumulated weight of a hard life pressing down on a body that was not as young as it had once been. A cough that began in October and did not end. A chest that tightened through November and December until it was tight enough that breathing became a kind of labor. The hospital in the nearby town was there, but medicine was costly, and every time they paid for medicine there was less money for the household, and every time there was less money for the household Adaeze sold more things from her garden and her stall, and the garden grew thinner, and the stall grew thinner, and Ezekiel grew thinner with them. He died in January, on a morning with no particular weather, quietly, in his own bed, with his head tilted to the left the way he always tilted it when he was thinking, as if his last thought was still in progress. What happened after that was a story Emeka knew well, because it happened in Emeka the way certain stories happen in certain places, not because the people are especially cruel, but because human nature does not need a villain to do damage. It only needs an opportunity and a closed eye. Ezekiel had a younger brother named Obiora. Obiora had been living in Lagos for many years, working in one capacity or another that he described grandly whenever he visited but that never seemed to produce any visible result. He had never liked Ezekiel's house. He had said so once, when he was drunk at a family gathering, in the way that people say the things they actually think when they believe the truth has become temporarily acceptable. He said the house was wasted on a furniture maker who could have been a real businessman if he had only had the ambition. Ezekiel had said nothing in response, which was what Ezekiel said when he had decided a thing was not worth his voice. Obiora came back to Emeka for the burial. He stayed afterward. He kept staying. He was still there 3 months later, and by then he had begun to talk about the compound in a way that made Adaeze's chest feel cold. He talked about it as if it were a general thing, a family thing, a question still to be decided. He brought papers to meetings of family elders that Adaeze was not invited to attend. He spoke to men of influence in the community, men who wore the right clothes and owned the right number of cows. He was strategic and patient and friendly in the way that certain people are friendly when they have already decided what they want and are only deciding how to get it. By the time Adaeze understood what was happening, it had already happened. The papers that Obiora brought to those meetings said what Obiora needed them to say. The elders who made the decisions made the ones that Obiora needed them to make. And Adaeze was told, in language that was polite enough to make the politeness feel like an insult, that the compound and the house belonged to the Okafor family, and that as a woman she had no claim to land under the customs of the community, and that she was welcome to continue living in the house on sufferance of the family, meaning Obiora. Obiora moved into the house 3 months after that. He came with a second wife, a young woman from Lagos who had nice shoes and never learned to cook yam the way it should be cooked, and who looked at Adaeze's garden as if it were a problem to be solved. Adaeze moved herself into the room at the back. Then, 6 months later, she moved herself out of that room too, because the second wife needed it for a relative, and there was no more room in the house that had been her house, on the land that had been her land, in the compound where her children had played and her mangoes had fallen. She took what she could carry and she went to the market. The market women knew her and some of them were kind. The woman who sold stockfish gave her a corner to sit for a while. The woman who sold palm oil let her use her fire on cold mornings. She began sleeping at the stall because the cost of a room was more than she could manage on what her small trade brought in, and sleeping at the stall was free, and Adaeze had learned, in the years since Ezekiel died, to make her calculations without sentimentality. Emeka, when she had told him on the phone what was happening with Obiora and the compound, had been quiet for a long time. She could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, and she could hear in the quality of his breathing the particular sound of a person holding themselves very still because they are feeling something too large to move around inside. He was 22 then and had been in the city for 3 years. He had gone with her blessing and the last of the money she had managed to keep hidden from Obiora's slow encroachment. A small sum she had been saving for years in a tin under the kitchen floor, the kind of saving that happens in increments so small each one seems meaningless and yet adds to something real. She had pressed the money into his hands the morning he left and told him not to come back until he had made something of himself, because the village had nothing left to offer a young man who wanted more than it could give. She had said it not because she wanted him gone but because she knew what the village would do to him if he stayed and remained poor, and she could not bear to watch that happening. He had cried. She had not. She had held herself straight the way she held herself in all things that cost her greatly, because she had learned from her mother and her mother's mother that certain griefs are too private for the air outside your body, and you carry them in the place behind the ribs where no one can see. He called every month for the first year. Then every 2 months. Then the calls came more and more like the rain in the dry season, expected and waited for and sometimes not arriving. She did not blame him for this. She knew the city the way you know a thing you have never been to but have heard about from people whose voices you trust. She knew it ate time and attention and wore people down in a particular way. She knew he was struggling. She could hear it in his voice, the tightness in it, the way he always said he was fine in exactly the tone of voice that meant he was not. The last call had been 4 years ago. Not a bad call. Not a goodbye. Just a call like the others, his voice and then her voice, a few minutes of things that were true but not the truest things, and then the line clicking off, and then waiting for the next one. Only the next one did not come. Then the month after that was also quiet. Then another month. She told herself he was busy. She told herself the way you tell yourself things when the alternative is to sit down with the weight of it and perhaps not get up again. She was not a woman who could afford to not get up again. She charged her phone at the stall when the man across the market who sold electronics let her use his socket. She kept the phone powered because hope is a practical thing and sometimes it looks like a charged battery. That was how things were in Emeka market when the morning came that everything changed. It was a Wednesday in the dry season, when the harmattan blew. Its fine pale dust over everything and the sky had the washed-out color of old cloth. Chisholm had left her bowl as usual, a piece of boiled plantain and a small cup of groundnut soup, covered with a plastic plate to keep the dust out. Adaeze had eaten it sitting at the edge of her sleeping place before she fully woke, moving between sleep and waking the way she did now, so gradually that there was never a clear line between the two, only a slow brightening of the world around her. She ate without tasting very much, not because the food was poor but because hunger, when it is a constant companion, loses its drama. You eat to continue and that is the shape of the day. She folded her cardboard sleeping mat the way she did every morning, precisely, with the careful folding of someone who has learned that things must be maintained even when the things are only cardboard, because the habit of maintaining things is what keeps a person from becoming the kind of person who doesn't. She tied her Ankara cloth into a wrapper around her waist and straightened the collar of her old blouse. She brought out the flat wooden tray from under the table and arranged on it the small things she had for today. 8 bags of groundnuts. A few bundles of utazi leaf. 3 bottles of the small local pepper sauce she made herself from peppers grown in a pot behind the stall. The one thing Obiora had not thought to claim because it was too small to notice. She set everything out with the same care she had always brought to her stall, though the stall had shrunk over the years to almost nothing, and settled herself on her low wooden stool behind the tray. Around her, the market was waking. The woman to her left, Mama Adaeze, was arranging her tomatoes in the precise concentric circles she always made, which was a habit so ingrained that she did it without looking, her eyes already scanning the path that led from the main road into the market, watching for the first customers of the day. Mama Adaeze was not unkind to Adaeze exactly. She was the kind of woman who had decided that Adaeze's situation was a lesson about life, and that the lesson was useful enough to be repeated, and so she repeated it at intervals that felt to Adaeze like the striking of a clock she had not asked to live next to. She had never once offered Adaeze food or shelter or anything tangible, because she said, in the way of a woman who has convinced herself she is being wise, that helping too much made people weak. What she meant was that helping cost something and she preferred to keep what she had, and the philosophy was a convenient way of dressing that preference. The woman on the other side, Mama Adaeze, was kinder indeed but uncomfortable about it. The way people are when they want to help someone who's falling feels too close to a thing that could happen to them. She sometimes pressed something into Adaeze's hand as she passed. A bottle of palm oil. Some stockfish. A small envelope of pepper. She did it quickly and looked away immediately after, as if she had not done it, and Adaeze received it the same way, pressing it into her bag without comment. And neither of them ever mentioned these exchanges because some kindnesses survive only in the silence around them. The market filled slowly. Footsteps on the red earth, the voices of sellers calling to early customers, the mechanical rattling of a generator somewhere at the far end of the row where the frozen fish sellers kept their coolers. The harmattan dust moved in slow spirals above the narrow alleys between stalls. Children who should have been in school darted between adult legs, carrying things or chasing each other or doing nothing particular with the full commitment that children bring to purposelessness. It was Chisholm who saw the man first. She saw him because she was sitting where she could see the entrance from the main road, and because she had the eyes of someone who noticed things, and because there was something about the way he moved that made noticing him unavoidable. He was not young, but not old. Perhaps 33, 34, though it was difficult to be certain because he carried himself with a stillness that was neither young nor old but simply present. He was tall, lean in the way of a person who has worked hard for many years and carries that work in his body. His clothes were simple but not poor. A clean white kaftan that was neither new nor worn, good leather sandals, a bag over one shoulder. Nothing about him said wealth loudly. But something about the way he looked at the market as he walked into it was not the way a man looks at a market he has come to buy from. It was the way a man looks at something he is trying to recognize. He moved slowly, his eyes going from stall to stall. Not browsing. Searching. There was a quality in the searching that Chisholm felt without being able to name. The kind of looking that has traveled a long distance and arrived with something specific it needs to find. He stopped twice, and each time his eyes moved to one stall in particular at the far end of the row, and then moved away again, as if he was not yet ready to go there, as if he needed to approach it from the inside out. Chisholm watched him. She watched the way the market women glanced at him and glanced away. She watched Mama Adaeze's eyes follow him with the assessing look she gave to everyone who passed, calculating what they might buy and from whom. She watched him pause at a small stall selling cola nut and bitter cola, buy something, hold it in his hand without eating it, and continue walking. She watched him stop, finally, at the end of the row. At the stall with the faded blue tarpaulin and the small wooden tray of groundnuts and pepper sauce and utazi leaf. At the stall where Mama Adaeze sat on her low wooden stool with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the middle distance in the way that eyes go when they are waiting without expectation. He stood there for a moment, this man who had walked into the market like someone who had traveled a great distance and arrived at the thing he was looking for and did not yet know what to do with having found it. And then, in a voice that was quiet enough that Chisholm almost did not hear it from where she sat, he said something. One word, or perhaps two. She could not make it out over the sounds of the market. But she saw Mama Adaeze's hands, the folded hands in her lap, go very still. She saw the older woman's head lift. She saw her look at the man standing at the edge of her stall, look at him in the way you look at something that is at once entirely familiar and impossibly impossible. The look of someone whose mind has understood something half a moment before the rest of them catches up. And then Chisholm saw something she had never seen in all the mornings she had watched Mama Adaeze. She saw the woman's face break open. Not with grief. Not with anger. With something that had no safe word because there is no safe word for the feeling of seeing, standing before you in the flesh and in the harmattan dust of a Wednesday market, the person you had long since taught yourself you might never see again. The man's bag slid from his shoulder. He caught it without looking, his eyes not moving from the woman at the stall. His jaw was tight. His eyes were bright in a way that the harmattan dust alone could not account for. And from 3 stalls away, Chisholm sat very still and watched, and felt in the air above the ordinary Wednesday market the presence of something that had taken 10 years to arrive. What happens in the body when it recognizes something the mind has given up on is not something that can be properly described by anyone who has not felt it. The doctors have words for some of it. The rush of something through the blood. The sudden change in the breath. The way the throat tightens and the eyes fill not from sadness but from a kind of pressure that has nowhere else to go. But the doctor's words are the outside of the thing. The inside of it is something else entirely, and it belongs to the person it is happening to, and you can only watch from the outside and understand that something real is taking place. Mama Adaeze rose from her stool. She did it slowly, the way she rose from everything now, with her hand on the edge of the table and her weight shifting carefully, because her knees had developed opinions about sudden movement over the past few years, and those opinions were not always convenient. But she rose, and she straightened, and she stood in front of her stall in the harmattan morning with the faded tarpaulin above her and the small tray of her small things before her, and she looked at the man who had stopped at the edge of her space. He had not moved, but he was standing with his bag caught in one hand and his cola nut in the other and his eyes on her face. And his face had the look of a person who has arrived at the end of a very long road and is no longer certain the arriving is real. He was breathing through his mouth in short, careful breaths, the way people breathe when they are trying to hold something in that is determined to come out. She looked at him. She looked at the line of his jaw and the width of his shoulders and the particular way he was standing with his weight slightly forward, which was a thing his father had also done, the unconscious lean of a man who is paying attention to something. She looked at his eyes, her eyes. The eyes she had looked into on the morning he was born and known, with the wordless certainty of a mother, that this person was going to cost her everything she had and she was going to give it without negotiation. Emeka, she said. It was not a question. It was not even quite a name. It was the sound a person makes when a word has been kept inside for so long that saying it aloud has become a physical act, like opening a door that has been shut for years and finding the hinges still work. He crossed the distance between them in 3 steps and she came forward to meet him, and then he was holding her, or she was holding him. It was impossible to say from the outside which of them was holding the other because they were both holding and both held, and the bag dropped to the ground between their feet and the cola nut rolled away somewhere and neither of them noticed. He was taller than she remembered. Or she was smaller. These were the adjustments 10 years make in the bodies of people who love each other, and you only understand them when you are standing close enough to feel them. She could feel him shaking. Not crying, not yet, just shaking the way a structure shakes when something that has been pressing against it from the outside finally stops pressing, and the whole thing has to remember how to hold itself without that resistance. She pressed her hand flat against the back of his head the way she had when he was small and frightened by thunder, and she felt his breath against her shoulder, jagged and then deeper, and she said nothing because there was nothing that needed to be said yet. The holding was enough. The holding was what the 10 years had been owed. Around them, the market continued its mourning. The tomatoes did not care. The stockfish did not pause. The generator at the far end kept its rattling conversation with itself. But the people nearest to them had gone quiet in the particular way that people go quiet when they understand they are in the presence of something private that has accidentally become public. Mama Adaeze had stopped arranging her tomatoes. She was watching with her mouth pressed into a thin line and her eyes moving between Adaeze and the stranger, calculating, recalibrating, trying to fit this moment into the categories she had available for it. Mama Adaeze had come to stand at the edge of her stall with her arms folded, not intrusively, but the way you stand near something that matters, just to be adjacent to it. Chisholm had set down the stockfish head she was arranging and was sitting on her stool with her hands in her lap and her eyes wide. She was not sure what she was watching exactly, but she was sure it was important, and she was sure she was going to remember it for the rest of her life. Emeka pulled back first, but he held his mother by both shoulders and looked at her, and what he saw in the looking made something move through his face that he could not control. He had prepared himself on the journey here for many things. He was a man who had learned, in 10 years of the city, to prepare himself for difficulty before it arrived, because the city punished the unprepared with a casual thoroughness that felt personal even when it was not. He had prepared himself for the possibility that she was unwell. He had prepared himself for the possibility that the house and compound were gone, because the messages he had finally received, months old by the time they found him through a chain of people and phone numbers and a cousin who had tracked down his contact, had told him as much. He had prepared himself for changes in her face, in her body, in the way she moved, but he had not prepared himself for the stall. He had not prepared himself for the cardboard at the foot of it, still slightly indented from sleep, still holding the shape of a body that had lain there through the night. He had not prepared himself for her feet, bare and cracked on the red earth. He had not prepared himself for the Ankara cloth she wore, the one he recognized because she had owned it since before he was born, now faded to a color that was almost something else entirely. That he looked at all of this without looking away, because Emeka was his father's son in this also, and Ezekiel Okafor had always believed that the truth deserved to be looked at directly, even when looking at it cost you something. "Mama," he said. His voice was steady. He had decided it would be steady. "How long?" She understood what he was asking. She did not pretend she did not. "Since the second dry season after your uncle moved into the house," she said. She said it plainly, the way she said things that she had already made her peace with. Not with bitterness. Not with the performance of suffering. Just with the flat, clear voice of a woman who has already processed what happened and moved past the processing stage into the stage of simply continuing. Emeka looked down at the ground between them for a moment. His jaw tightened. Then he looked up. "I am here now," he said. It was 4 words, and it was not 4 words. It was the whole of what he needed to say and could say in the middle of a market on a harmattan Wednesday, with people watching and more people pretending not to, and the rest of it could come later when there was privacy enough to hold it. She nodded once. Then she sat back down on her stool, because her knees were asking her to, and because sitting down was also a way of saying she believed him. He did not leave. He picked up his bag from the ground and settled it over his shoulder, and he sat on the edge of the table, which made the table creak in a way that suggested it was not designed for this use but was willing to try, and he sat there beside her through the morning. He did not make any loud declarations. He did not weep or rage or pace the way young men in stories about injustice sometimes do. He sat with her the way you sit with someone when you have been away too long, and sitting beside them is itself the apology. The whole of it, contained in the simple act of being present when you were absent. The market morning moved around them. Customers came to the stall, and Emeka watched his mother sell her small things with the careful attention of a man who is trying to understand something he cannot yet fully take in. She was good at it, even now, even reduced to what the stall had become. She remembered people's names and the names of their children and what they had bought the last time and whether they had mentioned something that they needed. She had the gift that certain market people have, which is not about selling at all but about making the person in front of you feel that they have been seen properly, and that what they need matters to someone other than themselves. She had always had this gift. When he was a child he had watched her with it and not known what to call it. He had a name for it now. He had lived long enough and worked hard enough to understand that what she did without thinking was something other people spent their whole careers trying to learn. The old woman to their left, Mama Adaeze, came over shortly before midday. She came in the guise of borrowing a knife, which was an excuse so thin it was almost not there, because Adaeze had no knife worth borrowing. But it served its actual purpose, which was to get close enough to look at Emeka properly, to study him with the assessing eyes she turned on everything that entered her radius. She looked at him. He looked back at her with his mother's direct, patient gaze. "You are her son," Mama Adaeze said. It was not quite a greeting. "Yes," Emeka said. She looked at him for another moment, this woman who had spent years watching Adaeze sleep under her stall and folding her own opinions about it into the careful shape of philosophy. Her eyes moved over his clean kaftan, his good sandals, the phone in his shirt pocket that was not a cheap phone. "She has been here a long time," Mama Adaeze said. Her voice had the quality of an accusation that was trying to dress itself as an observation. "Yes," Emeka said again. He did not flinch from the word or from the eyes that delivered it. "She has." Mama Adaeze looked at him once more, and then turned and went back to her tomatoes. She did not speak again for the rest of the morning, which was unusual enough that Mama Kososo raised her eyebrows slightly from across the row. It was Chisholm who brought water at midday. She brought 2 cups, not 1, which was the first time she had brought 2, and she placed them on the edge of the table without comment, though she looked at Emeka with the frank and open curiosity of a 14-year-old who has decided that politeness is less interesting than information. "Thank you," Emeka said to her. "Are you staying?" she asked. She asked the market directly, without preamble, because Chisholm's mother had raised her to use words efficiently. Adaeze made a sound that might have been the beginning of a correction. Emeka answered before it could arrive. "Yes," he said. "I am staying." Chisholm looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded once, in the way of someone who has asked the question that mattered and received the answer they were hoping for, and went back to her mother's stall. The afternoon was slower and hotter. The harmattan dust had settled into a fine haze that sat over the market like a thin veil, softening the light. Emeka bought food from the woman who walked the row with a tray of rice and stew on her head, balanced with the practiced ease of someone who had carried trays for 20 years and no longer thought about it. He bought 2 portions and gave one to his mother, and she ate without arguing about it, which told him more than an argument would have. A woman who still had fire enough to argue about being helped would have argued. She ate quietly, and it was the quiet of a person who has been tired for a long time. He watched her eat, and he thought about the last 10 years. Not as a punishment to himself, not as a rehearsal for the apology he owed her, but with the clear-eyed accounting of a person who needs to understand a thing fully before they can address it. He had left with good intentions, which meant nothing except that he had left with good intentions. He had struggled in the city, which was true and which also meant nothing except that it was true. He had lost contact gradually, incrementally, each missed call or unanswered message a small step away from what he had promised himself he would not step away from, until the distance between himself and Emeka was not just geographical but had become a kind of deliberate forgetting. The way you stop looking at a wound not because it has healed but because you cannot bear to look at it any longer, and looking at it does not seem to help. He had found his footing eventually. Not quickly, not easily, not in any way that made a good story when compressed. It had taken 8 years of the city to become the person who could afford a white kaftan and a good pair of sandals and a bus ticket back to Emeka with money still remaining. 8 years of the kind of work that nobody celebrates because it is not spectacular, only relentless. He had built something. Not grand, not yet, but solid. Real. The kind of thing that could be built upon. He had come back because of a dream. He did not say this to anyone because it was not the kind of thing that was easy to say without sounding like a man who had run out of rational explanations. But the dream was real. He had dreamed of the market at Emeka, the smell of it, the sounds, his mother's voice at her stall calling to a customer with that particular warmth she put into the calling. He had woken up and the dream was more real than the room around him, and the feeling it left was not nostalgia but urgency, the feeling of something unfinished pressing against the inside of you demanding to be addressed. He had stood up in his rented room in the city at 4 o'clock in the morning and begun to pack. He had not known what he would find. Now that he knew, he was very still and very clear inside himself about what came next. Late in the afternoon, when the market was thinning and the sellers were beginning the slow business of packing away for the day, Emeka said to his mother, "Tell me about Obiora." Adaeze was folding the tarpaulin corner with the careful, mechanical motion of a person doing something they have done hundreds of times. She did not stop folding when he asked. She kept working, and she talked while she worked, which was her way, because keeping the hands busy made the telling of hard things easier. She told him everything. Not all at once. In the way of someone who has organized a long story into sections over years of carrying it and knows which part goes where. She told him about the family meetings she had not been invited to. The papers Obiora had brought. The elders who had made the decisions Obiora needed them to make. She told him about the first room she had been given and then asked to leave. She told him about moving to the market and what that first night had been like, sleeping on the bare ground with no cardboard yet because she had not yet thought of the cardboard. She told it without self-pity. She did not perform her suffering for him. She simply relayed it, the way a person reads from a document, and the facts themselves were enough without decoration. Emeka listened. He listened all the way through, all the way to the end, without interrupting, without the sounds that people sometimes make to show they are listening because they have stopped truly doing it. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. He was looking at the entrance to the market, the path that led back toward the main road, back toward the compound that had been his father's and was now Obiora's. "Has he ever come here?" Emeka asked. "To the market?" "Once," Adaeze said. "In the beginning. To make sure I had gone." "And I had gone," she said simply. Emeka looked at the entrance for another moment. Then he looked back at his mother. "Is there somewhere I can sleep tonight?" She opened her mouth. He knew what she was going to say, that there was only the cardboard and the tarpaulin and the cold ground, and she was going to say it with the straightforward lack of shame that had always been one of the things he loved most about her. The refusal to perform embarrassment about circumstances she had not chosen. He spoke before she could. "Not here," he said. "Is there someone in Amakai who has a room? Someone we can trust?" She thought about it. "Mama Adaeze," she said after a moment. Her husband built an extra room that they rent sometimes. Emeka nodded. He looked at the woman across the row who was still packing her own stall, moving with the tired efficiency of a long day's end. He stood, straightened his kaftan, and walked the 12 steps to her stall. Mama Adaeze looked up when he arrived. She had the careful face of a woman who has learned not to be too easily surprised by anything, because the market teaches you that. "Good evening," Emeka said. He greeted her with the full respectful greeting, the bow of the head and the hands and the words that acknowledged her seniority, and she received it with the slight softening that happens in a person's face when they are respected in the way they were taught to expect respect. He explained what he needed. He was quiet and direct about it, and he named a fair price before she could name a price herself, which was a thing that told her something about him. When you name the fair price before you are asked, you are telling the person across from you that you already know what is fair and you are not trying to negotiate below it. She had done business with enough people to know the difference between the ones who did this and the ones who did not. She agreed. She told him the room was small but clean and that breakfast was available if he wanted it. He thanked her. He went back to his mother's stall. He helped her finish packing away for the evening, his hands finding the familiar work of folding and stacking and tying as if 10 years had not intervened between the last time he had done it and now. Muscle memory is longer than ordinary memory. The body holds what the mind lets go. If this story has found its way into your heart, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new tale from Village Heart. Your support is what keeps the fire burning and more stories like this one coming your way. He walked with her through the emptying market to Mama Adaeze's compound, which was 4 streets behind the market. It was a modest place with a good fence and a swept yard and 3 rooms visible from the entrance, the third of which had a door that Mama Adaeze opened with a key from her wrapper pocket. The room had a bed with a clean coverlet, a table, a small window that looked onto the yard. He paid her for 2 weeks, which made her look at him with the brief, recalculating look of a person revising their estimate of something. He asked if his mother could also have a room, or at least a place to sleep indoors. He asked it quietly and without drama, the way you ask something when you already know the answer will be yes if you ask it correctly. Mama Adaeze looked at him. She looked at Adaeze standing in the yard behind him. Something moved across her face, not guilt exactly, more like the feeling of a person who has been wanting to do a thing for a long time and has been waiting for permission from a source they could not name. She told him that the front room had a cot in it that she sometimes used for her grandchildren. She said Adaeze could sleep there, if that was acceptable. Adaeze said it was more than acceptable with the particular voice she used when something had moved her and she was not going to show how much. That night, sleeping in a real room for the first time in more than 2 years, on the cot with Mama Adaeze's grandchildren's blanket over her, Adaeze lay awake for a long time. Not from discomfort. From the opposite. The quiet of the room and the softness of the cot and the smell of wood smoke from someone's kitchen fire coming through the small window were all so different from the sounds and smells and textures of the market ground that her body did not know at first how to receive them. She lay still and let her body adjust. She listened to the night sounds of the compound, the guinea fowl that roosted in the mango tree near the fence, the distant sound of music from somewhere on the next street, a dog discussing something urgent with another dog far away. She thought about Emeka asleep in the next room. She thought about all the nights of the past 10 years, not with grief. She had already grieved everything there was to grieve and some things more than once, but with the particular clarity that comes when something you thought was finished turns out not to have been finished at all. The story had not ended the way she had thought it ended. The last chapter was not the one she had been living in. She pressed her hand flat against the wall beside the cot and felt the solidity of it. A real wall. Her son in the next room. The market 12 minutes walk away, where tomorrow she would sit at her stall again, because the habit of the market was in her now as deep as breathing, but now with something changed, something returned, something that had weight to it. She closed her eyes and slept. Emeka was awake long after she slept. He sat on the edge of the bed in the small room with his hands between his knees, and he thought about what came next. He had the kind of mind that did not like to remain in a feeling longer than the feeling required. Not because he was cold, but because he had learned, in the years of the city, that feelings were most useful when you used them as information and then turned them into action. What he felt tonight was a combination of grief and relief, and the kind of anger that does not express itself loudly, because loud anger is the most inefficient form, and efficiency was something he had thought a great deal about. The efficient form of the anger he was feeling was not a confrontation. It was a plan. He knew enough about Emeka and about the workings of land and family and custom to know that simply arriving and demanding what had been taken from his mother would accomplish nothing except alerting Obiora that someone had arrived who intended to demand things. And Obiora had shown, over the years, that he was good at making problems disappear before they became problems. He had done it with the land. He had done it with the elders. He would do it again if given the opportunity. So Emeka needed to understand the full picture before he moved. He needed to know what exactly had been done, in what order, by whom, with whose approval. He needed to know which of the elders Obiora had paid and which had been persuaded and which had simply been too tired or too afraid to object. He needed to know whether there were documents, and if there were, whether those documents had weaknesses. He needed information. He needed to talk to people. The right people. Carefully, without alerting Obiora, without making any move that could be seen as a move. He was a businessman. 10 years in the city had made him one, slowly, without ceremony. He knew how to read a situation, how to identify the pressure points, how to wait for the right moment and apply force precisely where it was needed. He had learned these things from hard teachers, which are the best kind, because the lesson stays. He also had something he had not had when he left Emeka at the age of 19. He had resources. Not vast resources. Not the kind that came with a driver and an assistant and a name in a business magazine. But the solid, real resources of a man who had spent 8 years building something from nothing. The kind of building that teaches you to be careful with what you have because you remember what nothing felt like. He had enough. The question was how to use it correctly. In the morning he went to the market with his mother. He sat beside her stall again, and this time he began to talk. Not to Adaeze, who already knew everything. He began to talk to the market. Not directly, not with any declaration, but in the way of a man who understands that a market is a living thing with its own memory and its own voice, and if you treat it with the respect it deserves, it will tell you what you need to know. He bought things. He bought more than he needed, from different stalls, and while he bought he talked, and while he talked he listened. He asked about the community in the easy, general way of a person who has been away and is catching up. He asked about the elders he remembered from his childhood, who was still there and who had passed. He asked about the market itself, the rent structure, who collected the stall fees, whether there had been any changes in recent years. The market women talked. Market women always talk, because information is currency in a market and the transaction is mutual. They talked about people he remembered. They talked about things that had changed and things that had not. They talked carefully around Obiora at first, the way people talk carefully around a thing they are not sure is safe to say. And then, as the morning lengthened and Emeka's manner settled their caution, they began to talk less carefully. What he learned in those conversations was more than he had expected and exactly what he had suspected. Obiora had not stopped at the compound. The compound had been the beginning. In the years since taking the house, Obiora had accumulated influence in Emeka in the way that certain men accumulate influence when they have decided that influence is what they want and they have no particular scruple about how it is acquired. He had positioned himself as a voice in community matters. He had done favors for people who could return favors. He had made himself uncomfortable to oppose. Several people in the market had felt the edge of this influence in various ways that they described in the careful, indirect language of people who are still uncertain about the consequences of speaking plainly. But there was also something else. Something that one of the older traders mentioned in passing, almost as a footnote, not realizing it was the most important thing she had said. She mentioned that Obiora's position in the community had a particular foundation. A particular document. A document that several people had signed and that a particular family elder had witnessed. a man named Benson who had been known for his scrupulousness before he had also been known for his susceptibility to certain kinds of persuasion. Emeka said nothing when he heard this. He simply nodded and moved the conversation gently forward as if the thing had been of only mild interest. Inside, he filed it away where it would be useful. He also, in the course of the morning, heard something that surprised him slightly, though he adjusted his surprise quickly because surprise was a reaction he had learned to treat as a private thing. He heard that Chisholm's mother, the stockfish woman, had a son who had trained as a legal clerk in the town courthouse and now worked there. This was mentioned as a piece of general community news, the kind of thing that mothers mention because their children's achievements are there. Achievements too, spoken without any particular connection to anything Emeka had been asking about. He heard it. He connected it to what he needed. He stored it. By midday he had a shape in his mind. Not a complete picture, not yet, but a shape, the outline of a thing that could be done. The beginning of a path that ran from where they were to where they needed to be. He had learned, in the city, that most problems have a solution that becomes visible once you understand the problem fully. The solution is rarely simple, but it is usually there, and the difference between the people who find it and the people who don't is patience and the willingness to look without flinching. He looked without flinching. In the early afternoon, a boy of about 12 came running into the market from the direction of the main road. He was one of the boys who made themselves useful in the market, carrying things, running errands, existing at the edge of the economy of small favors that held a place like Emeka together. He came to the stall of a woman 3 positions down from Adaeze and whispered something to her that made her look up sharply toward Emeka. She tried to make the look casual and did not quite succeed. Emeka noticed. He said nothing. He bought a bag of groundnuts from his mother's tray and opened it and ate them one at a time with the relaxed patience of a man who has nowhere urgent to be, which was one of the most useful things he had learned in the city. The appearance of having nowhere urgent to be, maintained consistently, was a kind of armor. 20 minutes later, the boy came back. This time he went to Mama Adaeze and spoke in her ear. She listened with her eyes on the tomatoes she was sorting. Her sorting slowed. Her eyes moved, briefly, to Emeka. Then a third time, 30 minutes after that, the boy came to the market from a different direction. This time he stopped in the middle of the row and looked toward Adaeze's stall with the undisguised, uncalculating look of a child who has been given a task and is completing it visually before continuing. He looked at Emeka with the frank appraisal of someone who has been told to look and is looking. Then he turned and went back the way he had come. Adaeze, who had been watching all of this from her stool with the peripheral attention she had developed over years of being in the market and needing to track everything without appearing to track it, said to Emeka quietly, without looking at him, "Obiora knows you are here." Emeka ate another groundnut. "I expected he would," he said. Adaeze was quiet for a moment. "He will not be pleased," she said. "No," Emeka agreed. "He will not." She looked at him then. The direct look that was her look and his, the look that did not curve away from what it was looking at. "What are you going to do?" Emeka looked at the entrance of the market, at the path that led back to the main road, back toward the compound that had been his father's. He thought about what he had learned in the morning's conversations. He thought about Chisholm's brother at the courthouse. He thought about the document and the elder named Benson and the shape of a path he had begun to see. He thought about his mother sleeping under a market stall for 2 years. "What needs to be done?" he said. The day passed in an ordinary way that was not ordinary at all. Customers came and went. The harmattan haze thickened in the afternoon and thinned again toward evening. The market did its daily work of exchanging things and the people in it did their daily work of watching and talking and calculating and deciding. Chisholm stayed later than usual, which her mother allowed because her mother had seen enough of the morning to understand that this was not a day to be ordinary about. When the light began to go golden in the way it did over Emeka in the early evening, turning the red earth amber and the tarpaulin roofs a kind of warm bronze, Emeka stood from the table edge where he had sat all day and stretched and looked at his mother. She was packing away her things. The bags of groundnuts she had not sold, the utazi leaf she would wrap in damp cloth to keep until morning. Her movements were the same as they had been every evening for 2 years, methodical and without self-pity. The movements of someone who has turned the routine of diminished circumstances into its own dignity. He watched her and something settled in him. Not peace exactly. More like resolve, which is what you have when peace is not yet available but you have decided what you are going to do and you believe it is right. He thought about the document Obiora had used. He thought about Elder Benson. He thought about the courthouse, a 20-minute drive from Emeka, where a legal clerk was working tomorrow morning. He thought about the kind of evidence that could not be argued away and the kind of argument that, made in the right place with the right preparation, became something that even the men who had once closed their doors to a widow's claim could not easily close a door on. He thought about his father's hands. The strong, quiet hands of a furniture maker. The hands that had built the table in the house that was no longer their house. The table was probably still there. Obiora would not have thrown away a good table. That was the kind of detail that told you who a person was, the things they kept and the things they discarded. He was going to bring his mother home. Not quickly, because quickly was not possible. Not loudly, because loud was not the way to do it. But with the same relentlessness that had kept her at that stall every morning for 2 years, that same refusal to accept a diminishment as permanent, that same quality he had inherited from her and had spent 10 years in the city learning to express in forms that the world responded to. He was going to bring her home. Around them, the last of the market day was winding down. Stalls closing. Sellers tying their wrapping cloths tighter against the cooling air. The boy who ran errands was eating something at the edge of the road, looking at nothing in particular with the satisfaction of a day's work and its small payment. Chisholm was walking home with her bucket on her head and her back straight, and she glanced over at Emeka as she passed and he gave her the small nod of someone who has registered a debt of kindness and intends to remember it. He did not know yet that the move he was about to make would not go unopposed. He did not know what Obiora was preparing, on the other side of the main road in the house that had been Ezekiel's, in the evening of the day that his spies had come back to him with the news that Emeka had returned. He did not know the lengths Obiora was willing to go to, or the people he would call, or the version of events he would begin to circulate through the community that evening over palm wine and the careful language of a man who needs his narrative to be the first one people. He did not know any of this yet. But neither did Obiora know what Emeka had become in 10 years, or what he had learned, or what he carried in the bag that was slung over his shoulder as he walked his mother out of the market and toward Mama Adaeze's compound in the golden evening. And in that particular gap, between what each man did not know about the other, the next few days would find their shape. Adaeze walked beside her son on the red earth road, her worn sandals raising small puffs of dust with each step. The evening birds were starting their conversation in the trees above the compound walls. The smell of cooking fires and suppers beginning was moving through the air, palm oil and crayfish and the particular warmth of a meal being made in a kitchen where someone is expected home. She breathed it in. She had smelled it every evening from the market, from the outside of it, for 2 years. Tonight it smelled different. Tonight it smelled like something she was part of again. She did not say any of this aloud. She walked and she breathed and she let the evening be what it was. Emeka walked beside her. He was quiet in the way he had been quiet since morning, the quiet of a person whose mind is doing several things at once and has organized them into a system that does not require the mouth. He walked with his weight slightly forward, the way his father had walked, the way of a man paying attention to something. Above them, the sky over Emeka was turning from gold to the deep bruised blue of a dry season evening, the stars beginning to appear in the places where the sky was darkest, not many yet but enough to suggest the rest were coming. It was the kind of evening that should not have been ordinary. And it was not ordinary. Though from the road it looked like a woman and her son walking home from the market, which was one of the most ordinary things in the world. That was the thing about the most important moments. They almost always look ordinary from the outside. The enormity is all on the inside, moving quietly, gathering itself, preparing for what comes next. Emeka went to the courthouse on Thursday morning. He went with 2 things in his bag. The first was a folder of documents he had spent 2 evenings assembling with the help of Chisholm's brother, a quiet and careful young man named Tabena who understood land records the way a doctor understands a body, knowing where every nerve ran and what happened when you pressed it. The second thing in the bag was a copy of a letter. An old letter, written in his father's handwriting, in which Ezekiel Okafor had recorded the names of the men present when the land was verbally agreed as his inheritance, and the date and the nature of the agreement. Ezekiel had kept records of everything. He was that kind of man. Emeka had found the letter folded inside his mother's Bible, which was one of the things she had taken with her when she left the house. She had not known it was there. She had carried it without knowing for 2 years. The courthouse in the town was not grand, but it was functional, and the man behind the land registry desk was thorough and unhurried, and what he found when he looked at the documents Tabena had helped locate was exactly what Emeka had expected to find. The original registration of the land in Ezekiel's name was on record. The transfer to Obiora was also on record, but the witnesses named in the transfer were not all of the elders who had supposedly approved it. One signature did not match the name beside it. Elder Benson, when Tabena had spoken to him quietly the previous evening, had admitted with the exhausted relief of a man who has been carrying a thing too long that he had not signed what he had been told he was signing. He was old and his eyes were poor, and he had trusted Obiora to read it to him correctly. Obiora had not. It took 4 days. 4 days of careful, undramatic work, of documents and conversations, and one formal meeting at the courthouse that Obiora attended believing he was there to defend a position that was solid, and discovered instead was built on ground that had already been removed from beneath him. He sat across a table from Emeka and a land officer and Tabena, and he looked at what had been assembled, and the thing that had sustained him for 3 years, the certainty that he had won, left his face in stages, each one visible. He said very little. That was the thing about Obiora that people had always misread. They thought his confidence was strength. It was not. It was the confidence of a man who had never been truly opposed, and when opposition came in a form he could not dismiss or maneuver around, there was nothing underneath the confidence to take its place. The land was returned to Adaeze Okafor. The documentation was amended. The officer stamped the paper with the stamp that makes things official, and the sound of it in the small room was the most satisfying sound Emeka had heard in 10 years. He did not look at Obiora when it was done. There was nothing in Obiora's face that he needed to see, and there was nothing he wished to put in his own face for Obiora to take away with him. He simply gathered the papers and thanked the officer and walked out into the afternoon sun. Adaeze was sitting outside on the bench where he had left her, because he had asked her to come and she had come, wearing her best wrapper, the one that was still almost its original color, because she had understood without being told that this was a day for the best wrapper. She had her hands folded in her lap and her back straight, and she was looking at the middle distance the way she looked at things when she was preparing herself for an outcome either way. He sat beside her. He placed the papers in her hands. She looked at them. She looked at the stamp and the officer's signature and her own name, Adaeze Okafor, typed in the clear black letters of official record. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at her son. Her direct, wide eyes, his eyes. Ezekiel kept records, Emeka said. He always kept records. Adaeze was quiet for a moment. Something moved through her face, complex and deep, and not entirely sadness and not entirely joy, but the particular emotion that has no clean name and lives in the space where those two things meet. He was that kind of man, she said softly. Yes, Emeka said. He was. They sat together on the bench in the afternoon for a while after that, saying nothing, which was not the silence of having nothing to say but the silence of having said what needed saying and now simply being in the aftermath of it, which is its own quiet country. The return to the compound was not dramatic. It was a Tuesday morning, 3 days after the courthouse, when the community had already heard through a match's thorough and efficient channels what had happened. Obiora had left the compound the previous evening with his wife and her good shoes and a vehicle loaded in the way of people who are leaving a place they expected to stay. He had not said goodbye to anyone. He would not have received many goodbyes in return. The market women came. Not all of them, but enough. Mama Adaeze came first, and she brought her sister, and her sister brought 2 women from the next row. Chisholm came with her mother, who walked more slowly than her daughter but with no less purpose. They came to the compound on the morning Adaeze walked back through the gate, and they came the way women come when a thing that was wrong has been made right and they want their presence to say what words do not quite cover. Adaeze walked into the yard and stood for a moment in the center of it. The mango trees were still there. They had always been there and they looked the same, 3 of them, older, broader, their roots pushing slightly at the earth around them in the patient way of trees that have decided where they belong and stopped asking permission. The house was the same zinc roof, the same 3 rooms, though the inside had changed in ways she would address gradually, in her own time. She pressed her hand against the wall of her own house. The same wall she had pressed her hand against on the night she lay in Mama Adaeze's front room listening to the guinea fowl in the mango tree. It felt the same. Solid. Real. The wall of a place that was hers. Chisholm, standing near the gate, watched Mama Adaeze press her hand to the wall and felt something move through her chest that she would remember for the rest of her life. She was 14 years old and she did not have the words for all of it yet. But she understood that she was watching what justice looked like when it arrived not as thunder but as a quiet hand on a familiar wall. Emeka stood in the yard of his father's compound and watched his mother move through the space that was hers again. Touching things, straightening things, moving through the rooms with the soft authority of someone who knows every corner and is reclaiming each one. Not loudly, just with the simple act of being present in them again. That evening, Adaeze cooked in her own kitchen for the first time in more than 2 years. She cooked egusi soup and she cooked it the way she had always cooked it, low and slow, the way her mother had taught her, tasting it 3 times before she was satisfied. The smell of it moved through the compound and out into the street, and it was a particular smell, the smell of a kitchen that has been returned to itself. Emeka sat at his father's table. The table was still there, as he had known it would be. Obiora would not have thrown away a good table. He ran his hand along the surface of it, the work of his father's hands, solid and well-made and lasting, the way his father had made everything. They ate together in the lamplight. They did not say very much. There was a great deal to say and it would take time to say it all, and they had time now. That was the thing they had now that they had not had before. Time, and a table, and a kitchen with a fire in it, and the rest of the night ahead, and tomorrow after that. Outside, the mango trees held the dark. Somewhere on the next street, someone was playing music softly. The evening birds had finished their conversation and the night insects had begun theirs. Emeka settled into its nighttime self, and in one compound on one road, a woman and her son ate supper at a table built by a man who had believed, without needing to say it, that the things you build with your hands and the things you build with your life are the same kind of building, and that both last if you make them true. Adaeze looked at her son across the table. He looked back at her. And in the lamplight, in the kitchen she had cooked in for 20 years, with the smell of egusi soup still warm in the air and her father's table beneath her hands, she allowed herself, quietly and completely, to be home. Thank you for sitting with this story all the way to the end. If it moved you, I think you'll find a home in the other videos on your screen right now. And if you haven't subscribed yet, come join us. There's always a place by the fire at Village Heart. Until next time.